Hi, I'm Sean, and this is a video version of a workshop I gave for the Scottish Council on Archives last year called Sustainability for Digital Community Archives. This video is aimed at community archives that are just starting to think about digital preservation and sustainability and want some basic tips and guidance. All the images in the presentation are courtesy of Jürgen Stamp, and you can see his details there. I've made some supporting notes, which is a big Google document full of all sorts of references and further reading material, and I strongly recommend that you take a look at that. For the workshop that I actually gave last year, I created some practical exercises. I'm not going to go through them today, but there is a link there so you can try those in your own time if you like. And just to say that all the slides, supporting notes and practical exercises are licensed for reuse. So I guess the first question to ask is, what does a digital community archive look like? What are we talking about here? So as far as I'm concerned, a digital community archive might be something like a website, a YouTube page, a social media page. It could be some files just sitting on your computer. It could be files on CDs or DVDs or other external storage. It's really any collection of digital material that you think tells your story. It could be things like photos, videos, audio recordings, oral histories, documents, web pages, social media posts, or emails. Your archive could be very large, very small. It could be entirely run by volunteers. It could be semi-pro. It could be long established or very recently established. It could be partnered in some ways with other organizations, or it could be completely deliberately independent. It could be entirely digital, or it could be partly digital and partly physical. So what do we see as being the threats to sustaining a digital archive? So what are the threats to sustaining or preserving a digital archive? It may be simple technical failure, perhaps your hard drive or some other bit of equipment stops working. Maybe obsolescence, by which we mean hardware, software, operating systems and file formats going out of use over time or no longer being supported. It could be simple human error. You or someone else might accidentally delete or change your digital stuff. Natural disaster, clearly things like flood and fire can destroy IT equipment. Attack, someone might maliciously, deliberately try and wreck your digital archive. Bad management, maybe it will simply be too difficult for anyone, including you, to use the archive. Lack of money, you may run out of money for digital storage or web hosting. And finally, lack of will, support or time. You may find that your group simply runs out of energy to keep your digital archive going, or that you bit off more than you could chew. So what can we do to mitigate against those risks? Well, by my reckoning, there's 5 things you can do. You can choose what you want to preserve, you can get hold of it, you can keep it safe, you can manage it, and finally you can make use of it. So firstly, choose carefully what you want to preserve. We're saying up front that you will not have the time, money or expertise to preserve absolutely everything you want, so you will have to be selective. So when choosing what you want to preserve, you should be asking yourself a few questions. Things like, are there multiple versions of this stuff I want to preserve? Do I need to preserve all of those versions, or just some of them, or only one? Will somebody else preserve this for me? Am I happy to let them do that, or do I want to do it? Does this stuff I want to preserve fit well with the rest of my collection? Am I building something coherent? Is this digital item a copy of a physical item? Do I want to keep the physical item too, or one, or both? Am I legally obliged to keep this stuff? There may be some records that you have to keep for legal reasons. Is it going to be very expensive to keep this digital stuff? Is it going to take up a lot of storage space? That might be particularly relevant if you're storing video or audio files. Other questions you may want to ask yourself are things like, is it too late to save it? Is it going to be beyond my resources and means to preserve this stuff? Do I even know what this content is? If I don't, am I going to be able to work it out? And if I can't, is there any point in keeping it? Has this content been published elsewhere, in which case I might expect someone else to look after it? Does it contain personal or sensitive information, in which case you'll be obliged to think about data protection legislation? Does it contain copyright material? If it does, you're going to be limited in the way that you can reuse or publish the material. And if it isn't copyright, do you know who the copyright holder is, and can you get in touch with them to ask for their permission to reuse the material? So once you've decided what you want to keep, you'll then have to get hold of it somehow. So when we ran the workshop last year, I developed some practical exercises which are linked to there. Those will take you through different ways of getting hold of different kinds of material, including Facebook content, Twitter content, emails, websites, files on hard drives, and data on CDs and DVDs. There's also plenty of information about different options and tools for getting hold of content in the supporting notes that I've linked to there. So once you've chosen what you want to store in your archive and you've got hold of it, you'll then have to move on to point 3, which is keeping it safe. In terms of keeping your digital content safe, a good rule of thumb is that the more copies you have, the less likely you are to lose your content. A good rule of thumb to follow is what we call the 3-2-1 rule. That suggests that you keep at least 3 copies of your files, you have 2 copies on at least 2 separate kinds of devices, and you have 1 copy that's stored in a completely different physical location. So in practice, that might look like an archive of digital photographs that maybe you keep a copy in your PC, a copy in your laptop, and a copy in cloud storage. The copy in cloud storage therefore being stored in a different physical location. You will also need to manage your digital archive. The key thing here is to know what you have. So you could keep a list of all your content in a spreadsheet, for example. You may also want to spend some time organizing your archive. So you might want to get rid of duplicates, spend some time describing or cataloging what you have and storing that in your spreadsheet. In some circumstances, it may also be appropriate to rename and reorder your collection to make it more usable. You'll also want to make sure that you check your backup copies periodically to make sure that they still work. Finally, you'll want to make use of your archive. Presumably, the whole point of preserving your digital archive is to make use of it. You'll also find that letting people use your archive is a good way of finding out if you're doing a good job, if you're preserving the right kind of material and making it accessible in the right kind of way. Remember though that you may have to restrict access to some of your archive. That will include considerations around copyright and GDPR or data protection. In terms of providing access, if your archive already takes the form of a website or social media page, then congratulations, you've already made it publicly accessible. But if not, you may want to think about sharing your archive through publicizing it and letting people know that it exists and how to contact you. You may want to make a website or a social media page, or you may want to add your content to an existing website or social media platform. There are a few other considerations when managing a digital archive that I'll talk through now. So one thing you may need to think about are file formats. As we said at the start, certain file formats seem likely to become difficult or impossible to use over time as they become obsolete or the software to play them becomes hard to get. So you'll want to make sure that you store files in formats that are likely to remain usable in the long term where you can. The supporting notes contain some guidance on the kind of file formats you should be aiming to store your archive in. You may also want to think about how you transfer your files around. Sometimes when you transfer files from one location to another, the copying process introduces errors into your digital archive. So if you have the extra time and resources, you may want to have a look at the supporting notes and use some of the tools mentioned there that will stop these errors from being introduced and will keep a good record of how your files have been moved around. Another thing you may want to read about in the supporting notes are fixity and checksums. So it's important that the users of your archive in the future have some assurances that your archive has not been changed over time, deliberately or accidentally. In digital preservation, the assurance that a file has remained the same, or that it has remained fixed, is called fixity. It's a term you'll see mentioned in the resources I link to in the supporting notes. People working with digital archives often use something called a checksum to demonstrate a file's fixity. You can think of a checksum as being a bit like a digital fingerprint in that it's unique to a file and that it doesn't change over time. A checksum can be generated using specially made tools that I link to in the supporting notes, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Another thing you may want to think about are partnerships and collaborations, especially if you're a volunteer of an archive where it can be difficult to get all the support you need. However, before entering into a partnership or collaboration, there are a few things you may want to consider, including but not limited to thinking about whether the organisation you're partnering with shares your values and is appropriate to work with your collection. You may want to think about whether the collaboration is fair to make sure that you are not doing all the work. You may even want to draw up a formal agreement stating who in the partnership is responsible for what. You should have a clear plan for how the partnership will proceed, who is responsible for what, and how eventually you can leave the partnership or collaboration if you want to. You may also need to think about copyright, and this will have some implications for what you can keep, what you can copy, and what you can publish online. I'd encourage you to think about this early on to avoid keeping material that you can't use in the future. You may also need to think about the General Data Protection Regulation. If your digital archive contains personal data, so things like names, addresses, emails, and so on, you'll need to consider that legislation. The supporting notes that I linked to earlier contain all sorts of advice and guidance and further reading about these two issues. Finally, you may want to think about professional standards. Archivists have developed all kinds of standards to help them run archives, including digital archives, and you'll see references to them in the supporting notes that I've provided. You might find them useful because they represent current best practice in archive management. They help make your archive interoperable and usable by other people, and they are all documented and will make it easy for other people to understand what you were doing and what you were hoping to achieve. On the other hand, some community archives prefer not to use professional standards or only use parts of them because they find the standards perhaps too difficult to use, or perhaps they don't think the standards are very good, or they just don't think the standards are suitable for their collection. Just something to think about. Well, thank you for listening. That was a very brief overview of topics you should be thinking about when considering sustainability for digital community archives. As I said at the start, please do take a look at the supporting notes. They contain lots more detail and further reading on these topics. If you have any questions or feedback about this particular talk, do contact me at the email or Twitter handle there. And finally, if you enjoyed this talk and would like to see further videos on similar topics, please do get in contact with the Scottish Council on Archives at their website or email address there. So thank you again for listening.